Hello everyone, my name is Ian McLaughlin and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and today I'd like to talk about a fairly novel treatment of one of the most common psychiatric conditions in the United States as well as worldwide, depression. So, in 2019, over 18% of adults experienced symptoms of depression in the 2 weeks prior to when the CDC explored their mental health. While most people don't have to confront the condition in the United States, a pretty substantial proportion clearly do. And globally, an absolutely gargantuan study published in The Lancet, the medical journal The Lancet, in 2018 found that in 2017, depressive disorders were among the leading causes of years lived with disability. And so the paper goes into pretty intense detail regarding far more than just depression, everything from diseases and injuries to and disabilities worldwide. But one of their main findings is that the incidence of depression-related psychiatric conditions has clearly increased over the years. Why that might be is an interesting conversation worth having, but more recently, there are trends that clearly indicate that, at least when it comes to the medications that are used to treat depression, those trends haven't trended in the direction that I think we'd all hope, with a pretty substantial increase in the percentage of antidepressants being prescribed. And of course, that's a pretty indirect measure of mental health, but it's just one of quite a few measures that suggest that the past year and a half hasn't been particularly helpful in addressing mental health concerns that predated the most recent public health crisis. And so here you can see. And so, to be clear, these are data from the United States, and there are clearly differences in how various countries that have handled things. But I suspect it's safe to expect that it hasn't had a particularly favorable effect on statistics of just mood-related psychiatric conditions in general. And, these are just, the most direct measures of psychiatric conditions. And, there are other more indirect measures of the state of, mental health in at least this country, which I'd, also be willing to bet aren't entirely unique to this country. Things like rates of drug overdose fatalities, as well as the rates of, the consumption of legal mind-altering substances, rates of antidepressant medications, again, right, rates of domestic abuse. And so all this to say, the state of mental health wasn't exactly optimal before this past year and a half, or more than a year and a half at this point, kind of surreal. And there are plenty of indications that suggest that this public health crisis has only been exacerbated by this past year and a half. And so, by the way, the public health crisis that we're still confronting, right? For both extremely unfortunate and inequitable reasons, as well as completely unjustifiable reasons induced by the spread of misinformation and, more despicably, in my mind, just pure cynicism. But anyways, depression has been a growing public health concern, both in the United States as well as internationally. And the reality is that, while we're fortunate to have some therapeutics and treatments that are effective for some folks, it's absolutely uncontroversial to acknowledge that there's room for improvement when it comes to how effective the available treatments are. And so, of course, depression is a pretty broad term, right? There are, different psychiatric conditions that fall under the sort of umbrella of depression. The sort of classic condition is major depression or major depressive disorder. And, generally speaking, that's the condition to which people are referring when using the term depression, right? But there are others, right? There's, persistent depressive disorder, for example, or what used to be called dysthymia, which is a sort of sustained, kind of subtle experience of depression that just doesn't quite reach the severity of a major depressive disorder, but ultimately absolutely diminishes quality of life in very meaningful ways. There's seasonal affective disorder, which is the experience of depression that sort of predictably emerges during the fall and the winter, quite literally when the sun is just up for less time. And so as a result, the resulting depression can last for 4 to 5 months a year. There's also bipolar disorder, which used to be called manic depression. And one of the first songs I ever learned on the guitar, by the way, by this gentleman. And if you're hearing that song title for the first time, you should just immediately check out the song by Jimi Hendrix. But anyways, bipolar disorder is a complicated condition that involves more than just depression. There are phases of what seem like the polar opposite of depression, phases that feel, absolutely euphoric and positive. However, those phases are followed by, phases of very severe depression. And then, many folks who've had children might be aware of perinatal depression, which women can experience while pregnant, as well as after a baby is born. So in other words, prenatal depression and postpartum depression. And, obviously this is, the experience of depression that only affects certain members of our communities, right? But it can be extremely dangerous for both the mother and the child. And so anyways, those are just some examples of depression-related psychiatric conditions. There are others. But the point I'm trying to make is that, this has not only been a growing public health concern that's only been exacerbated by the past year and a half, but that, many psychiatric conditions are associated with depression. And so when it comes to the study I'd like to discuss today, I'm exclusively focusing on pharmacological treatments for depression. Of course, there are non-pharmacological treatments that are critical and important tools when confronting this condition and mood-related conditions more broadly. So I'm definitely not suggesting that pharmacological treatments are the only important treatments. In fact, they're both optimal when combined. But they can be extremely helpful tools and life-saving tools. And that said, when it comes to pharmacological treatments, they're all really quite similar. The vast majority of these medications focus on altering the signaling of just a handful of neurotransmitters, the monoamines, serotonin, norepinephrine, and some of them also affect dopamine signaling. Some are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. Some are both serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs. And a few are both norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake inhibitors. There are some medications that don't work in the same way as those medications that are used to treat depression, like atypical antipsychotics. And of course, there are the medications that were used years before the newer ones were developed, like monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, and tricyclic antidepressants, which are used less frequently these days. But, fundamentally, the vast majority of these medications all revolve around modifying the activities of, the same handful of neurotransmitters, right? And while they've been effective for some folks, excuse me, and are, there are, while they've been effective for some people, right, there are certainly many for whom they're just insufficiently effective, right? And so as a result, there's been this effort to try and identify new ways to confront depression. And, some of the fairly surprising stories have been from the use of ketamine. And so, to be clear, ketamine is one of those molecules that has a bit of cultural baggage, you might say, right? Which puts it in a category of substances that used to be most closely associated with recreational use or misuse, depending on, your perspective. Substances like cannabis, psilocybin, and MDMA have all received attention for potential psychiatric applications, right? Generally for mood-related conditions, though cannabis seems to have been found to be effective for just a broader array of conditions, at least for some folks, right? And so, by the way, I've done some videos and podcasts on the psychiatric applications of these substances, and I have some links below to some of them if you're interested. But the point is, ever since the 60s, pretty much, at least in the United States, most of these substances developed a kind of a reputation for being either just purely recreational and maybe kind of frivolous, or maybe more perniciously, developed the reputation of being among the most harmful and dangerous substances that one can consume. And so ketamine, for example, was the substance of choice of John C. Lilly. And so now you're seeing two images of John C. Lilly. One seems like a pretty normal dude. The other is pretty interesting. And so his story is definitely interesting. It's a pretty wild story. You can see an interview he did while wearing this headgear on YouTube. You can just find it. But he's probably best known for pioneering the mechanism that's used for sensory deprivation, the flotation tank. Okay, and so this is basically just a completely dark, silent chamber with just enough super duper salty water along the bottom to enable a human body to float along the top without sinking. The water is maintained at a very specific temperature to ensure that, in a few minutes, it can sort of vary. It becomes kind of difficult to discern the boundary between the water and the air and the body. And so ultimately the brain receives very considerably less sensory inputs. It's deprived of sensory inputs. This tank, by the way, is one of the ones that are at some of the centers here in Philly. Great place, certainly recommended if you're interested and you're in the area once we're on the other side of this current public health crisis. But anyways, so the experience results in a state of mind where the mind is basically left to sort of drift unanchored. It's a very strange and interesting experience, quite surreal. I've done it a few times, and I'd most certainly only recommend it to people who've done at least a bit of sort of practice or have had at least a bit of experience with some meditation practice, particularly particularly for people who have an anxiety-associated condition, because sessions in these sensory deprivation tanks are typically pretty long, like an hour or more. But anyway, so John Lilly was the person who really pioneered this whole concept, among other things. There's also a sort of deliciously campy movie that's sort of loosely based on him called Altered States. I recommend it. It's kind of funny. He also got his MD at the University of Pennsylvania, where I went to grad school. He was there in 1942. Must have been a pretty interesting place all those decades ago. But in that era, when people were sort of kind of wildly, freely experimenting with these mind-altering substances, in the late 60s and early 70s, John Lilly was focused on ketamine, while much of the sort of lore of that era has focused on the psychedelic hallucinogens like LSD and psilocybin, right? So ketamine has always been a fairly interesting character in this kind of saga of finding, alternative pharmacological strategies to address psychiatric suffering, right? Neuropharmacologically, meaning like when it comes to what it is that these molecules do once they get into the brain, it's fundamentally unlike those other substances, right? MDMA, psilocybin, and even the standard antidepressants all share a sort of a fundamentally similar effect, right? Modifying how the neurotransmitter serotonin is acting. Psilocybin modifies serotonergic or serotonin-related signaling differently than MDMA does, and both of those substances act differently than the sort of currently standard antidepressants. Think SSRIs like Prozac or fluoxetine, Celexa, citalopram, Lexapro, escitalopram, Zoloft, sertraline, right? Those are some of the most commonly prescribed antidepressants. But all of those substances share at least one pharmacological effect, which is altering the way the neurotransmitter serotonin acts in the brain. And so, to be clear, like they all also influence other neurotransmitters, right? Other monoamine neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, dopamine, and so on. But the point I'm trying to hammer home is, despite the fact that psilocybin and MDMA are about as illegal as molecules can be, at least in the United States, as well as many other countries, despite that fact, these substances are all targeting essentially the same signaling system in the brain. And so why am I harping on this point, right? Well, when it comes to ketamine, and the same can sort of be said for cannabis, but to be fair, but when it comes to ketamine, we're talking about a fundamentally different signaling system in the brain. And so, the serotonin signaling system is definitely among the broader systems in the brain. And so, as you can see here, the majority of serotonin in the brain comes from a collection of little neuronal clusters, confusingly called nuclei. But it's not like a nucleus, like an atomic nucleus or the nucleus of a cell. It's like just a cluster of neurons. And these are called the raphe nuclei, which is sort of those maroon-covered ovals towards the bottom of the brain. Anyways, those clusters of serotonin-producing neurons are basically in the brainstem, sort of. I spent a whole lot of time exploring this anatomical neighborhood when I was doing my own research in the neurobiology of anxiety and addiction. But as you can see from all these crazy arrows going through the rest of the brain, those tiny clusters of neurons extend their influence to essentially the entire brain, right? Any region you can name. Even if you're completely unfamiliar with, brain science, structures like the hippocampus are influenced by serotonin. And so molecules like psilocybin, MDMA, and classic antidepressants, Prozac, fluoxetine, they will influence the way that serotonin is changing activity in all those brain regions. They do it in different ways. That's ultimately what they're doing. When it comes to ketamine, though, this molecule will affect an even more fundamental component of brain signaling. Ketamine is what's called an NMDA receptor antagonist, okay? Not the most coherent harmonic name for a receptor, and it's, not necessarily, critical to store that terminology, in your mind to appreciate the progress that the study we're going to discuss has made, right? But that said, this receptor, the NMDA receptor, is a really strange and unique receptor in the brain. I'm not going to burden you with like why that is, but it's sort of in a class of its own. And so generally, when students are starting out in studying neuroscience, this receptor is brought up in the context of learning and memory, the NMDA receptor. But this receptor is involved in regulating far more than just learning and memory. And so, several signaling molecules in the brain interact with the NMDA receptor, but the sort of central neurotransmitter that interacts with this NMDA receptor, which is the receptor with which ketamine interacts, is glutamate, right? That's the neurotransmitter that is fundamentally being altered by the action of ketamine. And so glutamate is one of the most basic neurotransmitters in the brain, okay? If you see any synapse, pretty much, or any point of communication between neurons, between brain cells, you're likely going to see some role played by glutamate. And so, I'm going to go with a sports metaphor. And I'm also going to pick a sport that's not necessarily the most popular in the United States, but just it should work. Just stick with me. So think of a synapse like a soccer field, a football pitch. a large rectangle of grass, grass-like material, I guess, where two teams of humans are kicking around a round object back and forth, right? A soccer field. So this is the soccer field that's actually used where I went to grad school. But so you have two teams of 11 players, right? And all of those players have responsibilities, but the fundamental goal is to score a goal. And the vast majority of the players can be, all over the field doing all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, there are two players who are almost certainly going to be in two specific places, the goalies, right? And so you can think of those goalies as being, glutamate, the other as being GABA. And so GABA is a principal off neurotransmitter, glutamate is a principal on neurotransmitter. And so glutamate will tend to cause neurons to fire action potentials, or you might call them impulses. GABA, on the other hand, the other neurotransmitter, the other goalie, will tend to prevent neurons from taking action, right? From firing impulses, right? Firing action potentials. And so you have all kinds of other players on the field doing all kinds of things with the ball, right? But at the end of the day, it comes down to whether the goalie stops the ball, right? So obviously a tortured metaphor, and I'm, by no means a big fan of the sport or anything, but that's sort of what's going on when it comes to glutamate and GABA, right? Pretty much any synapse or any point of contact between neurons, or let's communication, they don't physically contact, but pretty much any synapse will have glutamate and GABA working against each other to determine if a neuron is going to fire, right? And so a whole ton of other neurotransmitters will be tweaking the neuron this way or that, right? Subtly making it more or less likely to fire. But the most fundamental determining factors are how much glutamate or how much GABA are being released. Okay, and so ketamine influences glutamate signaling. One of the most fundamental signaling systems in the brain, and it prevents glutamate from binding one of the receptors that it binds, the NMDA receptor, right? And so, if you don't remember any of this pharmacology, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, the main point I'm trying to drive home is that ketamine is fundamentally different relative to all the other molecules that are used as medications to address psychiatric conditions, including depression, okay? And it's for that reason that I find it so interesting that ketamine has proven to be so effective in treating cases of depression that have been among the most difficult to treat. So studies have shown that ketamine can produce improvements in the symptoms of depression pretty rapidly. And maybe more importantly, those improvements last quite a while. And that's pretty different, right, when you compare the sort of course of action of standard antidepressants. But because of that complicated and unique pharmacology, there's sort of an ongoing debate in neuroscience regarding why and how it might be delivering this effect. And so I remember when I was, doing the whole process of, interview process at some of the graduate schools I might ultimately attend. One of the schools was at Tulane University in New Orleans. And so I was between two places pretty much, and it was honestly a pretty serious struggle in my mind. But one of the reasons was because I got to meet a neuroscientist named Benjamin Hall while he was at Tulane. I don't know if he's still there anymore, but and he talked about some of his work and hypotheses at the time. Keep in mind, this is many years ago at this point, about how it is that ketamine works. But more relevantly to today's discussion, why it is that ketamine seems to be surprisingly effective for people suffering from depression. And so, keep in mind, this was years before ketamine was so widely acknowledged within the field and within medicine as being a totally valid treatment option for treatment-resistant depression, severe depression, right? And I was pretty fresh out of college, and I was super interested in exactly that kind of work. And, while he was giving his presentation, I felt like he was speaking a language that I wanted to learn, And so all of his, his explanations all those years ago turned out to be pretty much the prevailing models of why it might be that ketamine can be useful for the treatment of depression, a direct and an indirect mechanism. And so, by the way, when I was interviewing at Tulane, they hosted the interviews on the weekend before, the Mardi Gras weekend. It was totally bananas, a total blast, super fun, and the conversations I had with all the grad students and interviewees in New Orleans make me wonder what life would have been like had I been there. But anyways, I hope you forgive that little reverie. But the point is that, even all those years ago, the question was no longer, is ketamine helpful for the treatment of, severe depression? The question at that point, all those years ago, was why is ketamine effective for the treatment of severe depression? And so while that brilliant scientist's explanations, which to be clear are still the prevailing explanations for the antidepressant effects of ketamine, while his explanations were totally edifying, this brings us to why I think this study I'd like to discuss today is very interesting. And so here it is. And so this is a study out of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, one of the leading biomedical institutions in the world. And the short story is that this study brings a different signaling system into the story of how it is that ketamine exerts its antidepressant effects, the adenosine signaling system. Also, it's published in a scientific journal called Molecular Psychiatry, which is an excellent scientific journal that everyone who does this kind of research will read. And so, as always, the reason I bring that up is that, as a result of that level of exposure, this research will have been and will continue to be scrutinized by a whole ton of scientists in the field. And in this specific field, right, who will, hone in on all the ways that, or all the deficits within the study and the sort of study's weak points. And, like always, there are always reasons to criticize any study, including this one. But the fundamental findings are quite interesting. So let's just get into it. So I know I've already tormented anybody who's listening to this with enough pharmacology, but almost anyone who's listening is almost certainly quite intimately familiar with the adenosine signaling system. In fact, you, as a sort of standard modern Homo sapien, are quite likely regularly consuming a drug, a substance, that interacts with the adenosine signaling system on a daily basis. If you ever drink beverages like coffee or tea, I'm more of a tea person, Coca-Cola, or energy drinks, right, or anything that contains a very specific molecule, you're regularly altering your adenosine signaling system. And so that molecule is caffeine. And so that's the molecule you're seeing right there. And so this study connects the therapeutic effect of ketamine to the same signaling system with which caffeine interacts. Kind of interesting, right? And so the authors acknowledge that, the majority of research up until theirs have suggested that the therapeutic effect of ketamine is via its direct interaction with that NMDA receptor, that antagonism of the NMDA receptor, blockage of that receptor. And so, to be more specific, for anybody who's interested in this sort of nitty-gritty, the byproduct of that binding, right? It's the disinhibition of afferents from GABAergic interneurons into glutamatergic neurons, right? Which results ultimately in elevated levels of glutamate. That's a sort of prevailing model for why it is that ketamine is effective. And so I know for the vast majority of people that's gibberish, but the point is that, the prevailing model is that ketamine ultimately results in elevations of glutamate levels in certain brain regions, and that elevated glutamate causes those neurons in those brain regions to become more active than they normally were before being exposed to ketamine. And so, and particularly when somebody's confronting depression, right? And so, as a result, when somebody who has severe depression, the model would stipulate, people are sort of nudged out of a kind of physiological state where they're just constantly stuck in depression, right? Those neuronal circuits are just less active in somebody with depression and less capable of becoming active for a whole variety of reasons. And the concept is that ketamine is capable of jarring those neuronal circuits into becoming more active, right? Which ultimately kind of resets those circuits, enabling at least some folks who are treated to emerge from those depths of severe depression. And so this study adds a bit of color to the understanding of how it is that ketamine ultimately achieves this effect, right? At least for some people. And so, I'll be honest, this is a nitty-gritty pharmacology study, and I don't think anyone outside the field would find, all of the details illuminating, but the sort of main argument, right, that this group is making is that the therapeutic effect of ketamine, rather than ultimately increasing glutamate signaling, is actually reducing glutamate signaling. And more specifically, immediately, having that effect immediately reducing glutamate. And so here's a quote from Per Svenningsson. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that name. He's a professor, or they're a professor at the Department of Clinical Neuroscience at Karolinska, and he's this person. I don't know. I'm not familiar with this person, but they are the senior author on the study. Okay, Per Svenningsson. Svenningsson says, elevated glutamate release has been linked to stress, depression, and other mood disorders, so lower glutamate levels may explain some of the effects of ketamine. So given the results of this study, I don't blame any of the scientists on this team for making such a broad statement, but I'll be honest, this is a pretty broad statement, right? That's true when it comes to linking, the levels of pretty much any neurotransmitter with something like depression, right? When it comes to levels of serotonin, for example, depression used to be conceived of as being a byproduct of insufficient levels of serotonin, right? And, we now know that, of course, it's just not that simple, right? And so that was the serotonin hypothesis of depression. There was also the norepinephrine hypothesis of depression. Both of them pretty similar, just different neurotransmitters, hopefully explaining why it is that some of these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are effective for some people, right? It was sort of working backwards. It was like, these molecules seem to be helpful. The history of the development of SSRIs is very interesting, and I think kind of illuminating as to the way that neuropharmacology has functioned for a long time. But anyways, high levels of glutamate being associated with depression is just, honestly, it hits me as being kind of insufficiently specific and just, almost not particularly useful. But that's okay, not a big deal. What the group found in this study was that when ketamine was exposed to neurons in specific parts of the brain, it did indeed reduce levels of glutamate release. They were using a sort of a fancier, newer technology to record changes in neurotransmitter levels relative to the past studies that have been used to find that ketamine increases glutamate levels, and so they were capable of being a little bit more precise. They also found that a different receptor than that the neurotransmitter glutamate binds is also likely involved in the therapeutic effects of ketamine. I won't abuse your attention by getting into that receptor because it also has a frustrating, immemorable name. But more importantly, this group is they're not the only team of scientists to suggest that there's more to the story of why it is that ketamine is effective, and it. Beyond just like the NMDA receptor, right? They're not the only team. But okay, so if that was just their finding that actually ketamine is reducing levels of glutamate in certain brain regions, that would be a meaningful scientific contribution on its own, right? Replicating the effects of other groups. It's always encouraging to see in science. You don't always see that. It's extremely difficult to replicate another group's findings, particularly at this level of granularity of neuropharmacology. Sort of like the central source of nutrition in science, really, replication, right? But the reason that this particular finding is interesting is that it implies that the hallucinogenic effects of ketamine, right? The effects that everyone who's treated with the substance for depression, presumably the reason that the colorful John C. Lilly found the molecule so compelling all those decades ago, those hallucinogenic effects aren't necessary to achieve the therapeutic effects that it's delivering for people who are suffering from severe treatment-resistant depression. Right? So in other words, like every substance people consume, this molecule interacts with multiple parts of the brain, multiple receptors, right? And more importantly, multiple neurotransmitters and their signaling systems, right? It's not like it's just like a scalpel, right? Generally speaking, it's more like a shotgun blast, right? Where a drug will interact with multiple receptors, not just one. And so, while the early story of ketamine focused on its interaction with the NMDA receptor, we now know that it influences the signaling of more than just one signaling system, right? More than just one receptor. And so the results of this study suggest that because ketamine interacts with this other receptor beyond the NMDA receptor, it's the AMPA receptor, in case anybody's curious, but it is another glutamate receptor, but there's this whole cascade of signaling that causes changes in adenosine signaling, that neurotransmitter with which caffeine interacts, right? And so all of that complexity ultimately results in reduced glutamate signaling very rapidly, right? Due to that interaction with the adenosine signaling system, like right when ketamine molecules reach synapses with those receptors. And due to that interaction, ketamine can relieve symptoms of depression almost immediately, right? At least in some folks, right? Particularly folks with severe and treatment-resistant depression. It's not like it's a panacea. It doesn't work for everybody perfectly. Generally speaking, it's reserved for like really severe cases of depression, and it doesn't always work for those folks either. But it is remarkably effective for many of them, right? And so. So this mechanism of action, this pharmacology, is distinct from the nature of our current frontline treatments for depression. SSRIs like Prozac or fluoxetine, Paxil, paroxetine, Zoloft, sertraline, right? All of which take several weeks to produce their antidepressant effects, right? Rather than just one shot go, right? Rather than just in one go, SSRIs notoriously take quite a while, whereas ketamine doesn't seem to have that deficit, and so. So this group did more than what I'm highlighting right now, as always. But okay, so why is this cool, right? Well, again, it implies that there's a whole new category of potential medications to treat depression. And I'm speculating here, but likely other mood-related psychiatric conditions as well that are just waiting to be developed, right? This opens the door to an entirely new neurotransmitter signaling system, and therefore on an entirely new category of drugs. And, to be more explicit, right, if it's not the interaction with the NMDA receptor that explains why it is that ketamine is helpful for people who suffer from severe depression, as this study indicates, and it's some other effect of ketamine, right, that it happens to induce, then we have the opportunity to figure out, what that other effect, that the other pharmacological effect really is. And once we figure that out, once we figure out what that effect is, that therapeutic effect of ketamine, then we can potentially find medications that deliver the therapeutic effects of ketamine, but don't induce all those other effects that may have absolutely nothing to do with the treatment of depression. The sort of disorienting, inebriating, hallucinogenic effects. And instead of 2 to 4 weeks, instead of having to wait 2 to 4 weeks, and we're now starting to tread into speculation here, but instead of waiting 2 to 4 weeks until antidepressant effects are delivered, this theoretical medication may deliver its therapeutic effect within a day. That's why I find this study to be so interesting and exciting. And so I'm going to be keeping my eye out for more progress in this story, because there's just no question that we are in dire need of more effective treatments to confront this public health issue that's really showing no signs of abating and only showing signs of getting worse. Okay, that's what I have for you today. If you're interested in this kind of discussion, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all those kinds of things. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Hey, Scott, thanks for joining in, man. Hey, Ron, good to see you. Ketamine is used for the treatment for treatment-resistant depression only. When it will be used as first option if it works so well? It's a great question. And actually, not only is ketamine used, but actually an analog of ketamine, what is it? Norketamine? No. Yeah, maybe it is norketamine, was approved, and it's a nasal spray. And so, I think we're getting there. The issue is that, I think we've all become more familiar with how the FDA works. The FDA can be slow on purpose. That's a good thing, actually. And it's intended to work slowly and deliberatively, right? And so somebody has to conduct those clinical trials, right? So the sort of history of ketamine being used is doctors were just trying things, right? There was a sort of anecdotal backstory, or anecdata had been gathering that, hey, ketamine seems to be like weirdly effective for treating depression. And so as those anecdata build, right, physicians start to, which they're empowered to do, prescribe it off-label, meaning just prescribe it for something for which it's not designed or designated. And as that happened, right, so who are the people who physicians would likely entertain that possible strategy? People for whom none of the other treatments are working, right? And so they'll just try, okay, let's try this. If nothing else is working, what's the worst that could happen? And we also know that ketamine is pretty safe. It's actually remarkably safe. It is addictive. It is habit forming, which is kind of unique among most of the hallucinogenic substances that people consume. So that is a problem, and it's typically used as an anesthetic. It's sort of in a category of dissociative anesthetic. But yeah, it can be used in surgery, but what's remarkable about it is that it doesn't suppress respiration the way that, let's say, opioids do. And so, it's just more difficult to overdose. So it was sort of widely recognized as being safe. It already is FDA approved for the treatment of other things. And so, yeah, so I think it was just like a selection of people who, were sort of in dire straits. And that's why, physicians entertain the notion, and then a clinical trial is conducted. Clinical trials are extremely, extremely expensive and difficult to conduct. Just the administrative, processes are really, really complicated. And so, somebody has to conduct a clinical trial on people who don't have treatment-resistant depression, who have just depression. And that clinical trial would also be a little bit more difficult because I suspect it would need to be designed to demonstrate that ketamine is like at least as effective, if not more effective, than frontline treatments for depression for it to be approved. That may change. The FDA seems to be in a bit of flux regarding how they're making decisions with surrogate markers of efficacy. This is a whole long other story. I'm already going along here, but I think that's why. Somebody has to invest the literal money to conduct the clinical trial, and you're not going to see Pfizer, you're not going to see Eli Lilly, these massive behemoths of pharmaceutical companies do that, right? Because there's just not a lot of profit to be made there, and quite a lot of investment. So that's what I think. I imagine it may be more likely that physicians will lead that, more sort of progressive, not in the political sense, but just sort of progressive, physicians who are interested in trying new things to improve the quality of life of people who are suffering from depression, which is, a significant public health concern. All right. Hey, Watchmaker. Thanks for jumping in, man. All right. So that's what I have for you. Sort of a short story today, but an exciting study, in my opinion. And so thanks for joining. If you're interested in this kind of thing, maybe you'll consider liking and subscribing and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will see you next week. See ya.